Hi, my name is Fred Cookinham, and I'm the author of Man in the Place of the Gods. This is my latest book. I can't tell you how happy it makes me to be able to say this is my latest book without it also being my earliest book. But now that I've written two, this is my latest book. What's it about? Well, that's a little difficult. I have a highly associative mind, so I think of one thing and that just leads me to think of something else. So it's all in here. Basically, the entire universe is in one book. My first book was called The Age of Rand, Imagining an Objectivist Future World. And this is pretty much the same thing. This is commentary about the philosophy of Ayn Rand. But it's from a particular angle this time, and that is the association of Rand's ideas with cities. This is all about cities. I'm writing in my capacity as a New York City tour guide. I give about 25 different walking tours. 5 of them are about Ayn Rand. Others are about the American Revolution in New York, which is how I came in the American Revolution Roundtable. And it's also from the point, where are my notes? I can do with my notes. They're here somewhere. There they are. Okay. Now, what was I going to say? Get a 2-liter bottle of iced tea. Oh, on the back of the book, it says architecture. Now, the only reason for that is that iUniverse, the publisher, requires that you put some category on the book. But this is such a cross-disciplinary book that architecture doesn't begin to cover what this book is about. At the top of the back, I say, who says secular people can't be spiritual? And that is my particular point of view here. I'm taking the fact that Rand was a secular person, she was an atheist, and I'm combining that with the idea of cities, and I'm saying, okay, for our primitive ancestors, the world was made up of nature and gods and demons and elves and kobolds. I bet anybody know what a kobold is? Anybody here from Germany by any chance? This is an interesting one.
No. Lives underground.
Yeah. The kobold is in German legend is some sort of an evil sprite that lives in the ground. German silver miners would find impurities in the silver ore, and so that they would say, well, those were put there by the kobolds, and that became the element cobalt. That's the reason why it's called cobalt. So our ancestors lived in a world of what we would consider superstitious beliefs in gods and magic and omens and so on. Well, today we're all, of course, very sophisticated and educated. This is the 21st century. And, but does that mean that we can't have feelings of reverence? But if we do want to have feelings of reverence, we have to find something to be reverent about. So if it's not going to be gods, perhaps it could be about man himself. And that is what Rand gets from Aristotle. Rand's and Aristotle's whole project was about asking the question, what is man? What is the nature of man? What is the nature of the human animal? What does man require by his nature for his survival and happiness? And when you think about the things that man does that make human life possible, there's something that's worth being reverent about. I find Rand to be a kind of a religious person trapped in an atheist's body. In her fiction and nonfiction, she used words like spirituality or spirit or spiritual many times, but she made clear that she meant spiritual only in Aristotle's sense of consciousness, mind. It is in the city, then, that we find the greatest monument to man, the rational builder and inventor. Now, one phrase that I made good use of in this book came from a reporter from the Wall Street Journal. Her name was Ann Cadet, and she was writing an article about tour guides. And she said, for your inner objectivist, exist. There's even a walking tour called Ayn Rand's New York, believe it or not. And she came to the Junto once, the discussion group that many of us go to once a month. She was writing also about New York City, about the skyscrapers, about the Empire State Building, and why do people come from all over the world as immigrants, but also why do people come as tourists? And why do people go to the top of the Empire State Building? And what is it that people react to and feel and pay $35 for the privilege of to go to the top of the Empire State Building? What is it that people are looking at that's so enthralling? And her conclusion is that what you see when you look at the city is man's achievement. And that's what's so thrilling and so exciting, and that's what draws people to the big city. And then she uses the phrase, not to get all Ayn Rand about it, but man's achievements are really thrilling to look at. And I just love that phrase, not to get all Ayn Rand about it. So this is the book you read when you are in a mood to get all Ayn Rand about it. That's what we're doing here. And what else did I want to squeeze in? I think we'll skip that. Here's what I mean by Rand was a religious person trapped in an atheist's body. She said in one of her articles that reading thrillers by writers like Mickey Spillane and Ian Fleming give her the feeling of listening to a band in a park, but reading the novels of Victor Hugo give her the feeling of entering a cathedral. So that's what I mean when I say there is a spirituality about Rand that comes through in her fiction and nonfiction, to which 21st century people have to find secular uses. It's a very interesting thing, too, that she said once about her husband, Frank O'Connor. She said, in her thick Russian accent, she said, Frank is more of an atheist than I am. And I know exactly what she was talking about when she said that, because Ayn grew up in a Jewish family in St. Petersburg, Russia, not terribly religious, pretty well educated, pretty secular, but Frank grew up in a big Irish Catholic family in Lorain, Ohio. He had 8 or 9 brothers and sisters, and he had to go to the Catholic schools and suffer under the nuns. And so he nursed a lifelong resentment against the strictness of his Catholic upbringing. I've seen examples of that myself. Other people. I come from a Presbyterian upbringing. My father used to say that the Presbyterian Church is the least demonstrative of the Christian denominations. By demonstrative, I think he meant ceremonial or ceremonial. Ritualistic, thank you. So my upbringing and Ayn's was pretty easygoing compared to the strict religious upbringing that some kids get. And I understand why they do carry on that resentment all their lives. Thomas Jefferson was one. He was brought up educated by a very strict Anglican tutor, and that turned him into a hater of religion all his life. So if you don't have that early experience that turns you off and makes you angry against religion, then you can later on in life you can have secular feelings without having that bugaboo in the back of your mind, and you can apply your feelings of reverence toward other things. And so I begin my book by asking, what is a temple? A temple is, in ancient times, is the building that you build to house your gods, and you bring sacrifices to them. And so I'm drawing the parallel throughout the book here between the ancient mind with gods and temples and magic and superstition, and the modern mind with feelings of reverence and not knowing where to put it. And so where you put it is in reverence toward man, the modern builder and inventor, and thus we have cities. And so what I'm trying to do is to give you point out to you things that we look at every day and don't think about. One of my favorite examples is shop windows, coming from the rural and suburban areas around Syracuse to the big city. One of the first things I noticed was driving down the street and you just see shop after shop after shop after shop after shop. Now, I'd seen shop storefronts before in Syracuse and other places, but I was just overwhelmed by the size, just the endless galaxy of shops of all kinds and all kinds of specialized shops. Some of us might remember laissez-faire books long ago, a whole bookstore just devoted to the objectivist and libertarian crowd, which is pretty specialized. But they just went on endlessly, block after block, mile after mile, and I'm thinking every single one of those shops represents some entrepreneur. It represents an act of courage, somebody who took a risk and started a small business. Now, that's what I'm talking about when I say something that you can, a place where you can put your unused feelings of reverence. I also put some articles in the back of the book, 3 of which were posted on the Atmosphere, which is an objectivist website, and then 3 other articles that have not appeared anywhere. One of them is called Ayn Rand's UFO. That's kind of a funny one. I read that just the other day at the Junto, but I'll use that to whet your appetite. And with that, I believe I will turn it back to our MC.
All right.
On my tours, I've mentioned that sometimes amidst all the media here and banking and everything else that goes on in New York City, we sometimes forget that this is a seaport. That was the original reason. That was the base industry. One of the things that I think mankind is likely to see in the next 50 and 100 years is the decoupling of cities from base industries. If we have, just to take one example, solar power, wherever there's sunshine, you could have a city. And I think that what's going to happen is that more and more people are going to build cities and they're going to live in cities because they want to live an urban lifestyle. And it's not going to matter so much where that city is located. We're seeing that with Dubai, a city that's sprung up out of the desert in 3 decades. Up until now, our ancestors have lived in cities because they had to, because the cities are where the jobs are, and the jobs are there because of the base industry. In New York City, the base industry is the harbor. It's one of the biggest and best natural harbors in the world, and so that's why there's a city here, that and the fur trade, the beavers. Some cities start because of fords. London began as a city because not only is it a ford on the Thames River, but it's the farthest downstream ford on the Thames River. So any farther downstream, if you want to cross the Thames, you have to either build a boat or swim. So every city has a base industry, but in the future, people are going to decide to live in a city because they like living in cities. Now, in my case, I'm very nearsighted. It's very hard for me to drive safely, so I'm pretty much, the choice has been taken out of my hands. I pretty much have to live in the city and walk everywhere and take the subway everywhere rather than drive, which is what most of the people in the world do today. But some people live in cities just because they like living the urban lifestyle. And in this, as in so many other ways, we're seeing modern life allowing man to make more of his life a matter of his personal choice rather than bowing to necessity. We're learning mankind, because of modern science and technology, we're putting more and more things taking things from the have to category and putting them in the want to category.
You talked about the spiritual quality in cities. When you compare various cities, do different cities have different spiritual qualities? For example, let's say Dubai today versus say 19th century London on one hand, or say 18th century Paris, or Constantinople in its heyday. Do they have different spiritual qualities, or?
Sure. Different cities have different personalities, and they mean different things to different people. Someone once years ago told me, as I was on my way to Toronto, that in Toronto you'll find something of the big city atmosphere of New York combined with the old world charm of London. Someone I knew in Detroit told me that Detroit combines all of the big city problems of New York with none of the sophisticated pleasures of any kind associated with New York. And there are cities that are going up and down at various rates. Right now, one interesting thing about Detroit is that because it has such terrible problems, it has found itself turning into a laboratory for everybody from around the world who wants to try out his scheme for making Detroit come back to life. So it's fun to watch that experimentation. So even when things are bad, in a way, they're good.
But yet cities that
sorry, I'm ready. So you mentioned that Frank O'Connor, Ayn Rand's husband, was more of an atheist than Rand herself because she was rebellious towards. He was more rebellious towards his religious upbringing.
Right.
Can that same concept be applied to, say, because I'm going through the same thing, through, say, a college dropout who is surrounded by people trying to, pressure him or her to go to college?
Pressuring people, pressuring young people especially to go to college or do something else. That's another favorite subject of Rand's. She several times uses the example of, in her criticism of altruism and self-sacrifice as a moral ideal. She points to people who are under family pressure to be the chip off the old block and go into the same profession that his father did, and he doesn't want to go into that profession. Also, she knew some people in real life who went through exactly that dilemma. That's a common thing. In that field, we also find reason for optimism because today, more and more, the big cosmopolitan culture of the world, I find, is becoming more one of do your own thing. Whatever it is you love doing, what you excel at, people are being encouraged to do that. As you go back in history, you find more and more of the pressure to conform. And that's something that John mentions in his books. There are characters in your books who are under pressure. If your father's a farmer, you got to be a farmer. And also, in colonial New York, there was a lot of religious pressure to conform that, thank goodness, is starting to go away. Until, hang on, one more point. Until the American Revolution, if you were Catholic in New York City, you kept it to yourself. You didn't tell anybody because the big Cold War of those centuries was still Catholic versus Protestant. And anybody who was openly Catholic in colonial New York was always under suspicion of being a spy for the dreaded Spanish. So things are getting better.
I don't think anybody reforms didn't exactly get along either.
I mean, people
I have a
think.
question about Ayn Rand. I like the comment that you made when we started out with Ayn Rand being an atheist. But then I think you made a comment that she is somewhat religious or spiritual. And my experience with Ayn Rand is The Fountain is one of my favorite books. I read it when I was growing up, and Atlas Shrugged. And I came to her objectivism later, but I thought she was just a terrific, tremendous writer. And anyone who creates art like that has to be spiritual, religious, even if they don't think they are. Could you cite any proof, though, that she is spiritual and religious?
Oh, just go through her writings or anything, anywhere, and just look for, this is what I do in my book, look for words associated with religion, like the word temple. Wikipedia calls itself a temple. There are museums that like to call themselves temples. The Motion Picture Arts and Sciences Academy calls itself the temple of movies. Look at the big, old, gaudy movie palaces of the 20s. The Oceana, is that the name of it, in Brooklyn? And there's one up in Brooklyn, up in Washington Heights. It's on one of my Revolutionary War tours. Recently used as a church by Reverend Ike. Reverend Ike? That's a big old over-the-top architectural fantasia from the 20s. But these theaters from the 20s have often been called cathedrals of films and temples of films and so on. So that religious imagery is in our heads all the time. You can't get through the day without using religious imagery in your language, in your everyday language. So it's present in Rand's writings, but it's all around us, and it's interesting to go through, to just keep your eyes and ears open and look for words like temple and cathedral and see how people use them.
This has to be the last question, so that we can.
Okay.
wrap up.
There's an exchange in the Fountainhead that's relevant to this point. Then you must remember it because Rand thought she had to explain it, and that's when one of Howard Rourke's clients says, Mr. Rourke, you are a very religious man, and he says that's true. And then Rand apparently got some flack from that, so she said, well, I wasn't implying that he believes in God, but rather that, you might remember it, Fred, but that he has a kind of secular spirituality.
Yeah, and the point here and the point throughout my book is that the religious folks do not have to have a monopoly on words like reverence and spirituality.